stood Jaazaniah, the son of Shaphan. Each man had a censer in his hand, and a thick cloud of incense went up. Then he said to me, Son of man, have you seen what the elders of the house of Israel do in the dark? Every man in the room of his idols. And that's enough. We'll stop there. Have you seen what all the elders of Israel are doing? If you read it in my translation, it says, have you seen what the elders are doing in the chambers of their imagery? In the chambers of their imagination. When nobody else, you think nobody can see what you're thinking. If our teenagers and if the rest of us are ever going to get there, we're going to have the fear of God in our lives, the fear of Adonai. We think these things, we look at these things because we don't think anybody can see into the chambers of our imagination. But you deal with a God, the one true God, the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. He can see into the chambers of your imagination. That ought to scare us. It doesn't scare us until we get the fear of the Lord in us. When we get the fear of the Lord in us, then we begin to realize He knows everything about my life. He knows what I do in the dark. He knows what I think in the chambers of my imagination. So, here's what I want to say today. I want to make 2 points. Number one, these ethical, moral laws of the Torah have stood the test of time. They're still online as far as Adonai is concerned. The ethical and moral parameters established by the Torah and the prophets and the Brit Hadashah, they're still in line, online with Adonai. They've stood the test of time. Number two, the blood atonement of Yeshua that was put over the Holy of Holies, that was put over the door of our hearts, it also has stood the test of time. For 2,000 years, the blood of Messiah Yeshua has stood the test of time. When the temple has been destroyed, when there are no more sacrifices, the sacrifice, the blood of Messiah, it's stood the test of time. So Beth Messiah, listen, I'm going to tell you what we need today. If the moral and ethical parameters and laws of Torah, if they've stood the test of time, and they have, and if the blood atonement of Yeshua that brought forgiveness to us when we broke those ethical and moral laws, is there anybody here who's never broken an ethical or moral law? Please don't raise your hand. Because if you raise your hand, you're lying. There's nobody here that hasn't at some time in their life broken an ethical or a moral law of God. Some of you, if you're thinking, well, I don't think I have, well, you just broke one. Those laws have stood the test of time, and so has the blood of Messiah. I want to tell you something about time. In the book of Daniel, and we're not going to go to it, but in Daniel chapter 12, it says in the last days that knowledge is going to increase, and the sense of the word used there is knowledge is going to increase exponentially. There's going to be an exponential increase of knowledge on the earth. Listen, my mama is 92 years old. Her generation, if you're 90 years or older today, I don't think you're here, but if you are, I'd like to talk with you afterwards. If that 90-year upward generation, I tell you, they saw more technological advances in their lifetime. It just swamped them. They went from outhouse to microchips with volumes of knowledge on a little microchip. Daniel Worthen was in my office the other night after prayer. I think he had his, I don't even know what you call it, iPod, C-pod, I don't know what it was. He took something out and took a little tiny chip. He said, brother, you know how many books are on here? And then he told me, and I said, don't tell me such things. I don't even remember. I said, I'm like, how is that possible? My mother's generation, from outhouses to microchips to technology that has just run past them. It's running past me. It's running past some of you parents, and you don't think it is. But your children, how many of you would say today, my child knows more than I do about all this technology? Listen, in that same time period, spiritual time has begun to increase exponentially as well. In 1948, when Israel became a nation again, I'm telling you, you have no idea. Unless the Spirit of God reveals it to you, you have no idea. Spiritual time is increasing exponentially. Do you watch the news? You should tune in every once in a while. Every couple of days you should watch the unrest in the world today. The Muslim nations, they're rioting. Listen, we haven't even seen the tough times come. You say, Rabbi, we're having what's short of a depression, a recession? We're having a recession. Yeah, I know that. Wait till you see a worldwide depression again, like is going to overshadow the first one. It's gonna be uncanny what's going on. Israel is a nation. Israel's back in the land. Every nation, you say, God, how did you know that? Do you ever just sneak up on God and say, God, how'd you know that? You're incredible. How'd you know that? How'd you know that all the nations of the earth were going to join against Israel and say, you give them Jerusalem? How'd you know that? How'd you know Jerusalem was going to become a stumbling stone around the neck of all the nations? And you used to think, well, it won't happen to America. Oh, really? We'll sell them down the river. We're doing it. Listen. We need something desperately to help us in these times. And I had a dream last week, not this week, but last week. And I was going to share it, but the bar mitzvah last week, it just didn't seem time, so I thought I'd share it today. You ever have one of those dreams? Now, I've only had two dreams that I knew. God spoke, gave me discernment and guidance. I knew that I'd heard the voice of the Lord like I've never heard. I'm not saying that I heard the Lord like that in this dream, but I do believe this dream was of the Lord. And it was so unbelievably refreshing and joyful and burden easing, if I could. That's not a word. How can I say that? It eased any burden I might have in this area. Here's what I dreamed. I woke up with it. My dad and I used to work together in the peanut shelling industry, and our livelihood depended upon farmers to get rain and produce peanuts. No peanuts, no business. We bought peanuts from the farmers by the thousands of tons, and then we shelled them out, and then we sold them to Skippy Peanut Butter Company and Curtis Manufacturing, who made Butterfingers back then. All that's changed, and they've sold out, and you know how all the big companies are selling out to bigger companies. But back then, we would ship 100,000-pound carloads of peanuts, shelled peanuts, in 100-pound burlap bags or 125-pound burlap bags. We'd ship them all over the nation. And my dad and I worked together for about 8 years in that business. And my dad was in this dream, but it wasn't as vivid. I've had a dream of my dad before that was really healing in my soul. But it was just like my dad and I were talking, because we were looking at the ditches where they were getting water to try to water these peanuts in these little ditches, just little ditches is all only, and some of them were dry. There were 3 or 4 of them, but some had trickles of water. They're trying to get, there's not enough water, and we're like, you get this feeling of like Adam must have felt. I labor in the fields. I work in the fields all day long, and there seems so little for my efforts, and there seems so little for our efforts. It's like we've worked, and the farmers have worked, and there's just so little. But my dad's kind of excited. My dad was not that excitable. And my dad was kind of excited in this dream. And he said, son, you're not going to believe this. And I said, what? And he said, son, you're not going to believe it. And I said, Dad, what are you talking about? And he said, son, if I could draw this picture for you, here's our little enclave right here. This is where we live. It's agriculture. There's a city there. We kind of lived in a little city, but it was a small city, and the peanuts were all out in the fields, and so that was our little enclave, and there were these little ditches running in, and then there was this huge river, bigger than the Mississippi ever dreamed of being, and it ran like this. Now, we're right up there, and here comes this river, and it goes way up, over and around here, comes way down here, and then it just keeps going. It bypassed us by miles and miles and miles. And my dad is smiling. He says, son, you're not going to believe this. And I said, what? And he said, they're bringing the river right through our town. And I said, what are you talking about? He said, son, you know the river? I said, yeah, the river. He said, they're bringing it right through our town. We're never going to have to want for water again. And all of us, I said, who's bringing it? And he went, they are. He pointed up. They are, like the authorities. And all of a sudden, I saw the river of God. It made the Mississippi River look very tiny. And all of a sudden, it was flowing right through our town. And it was pure, clean water. And there was this sense. It was a twofold sense I got out of this thing. Number one, the volume of it and the purity of it was incredible. There was so much pure, clean water. I mean water like I've never seen in my life. And the second thing I got, and this was just as good, I didn't do anything to bring it. I wasn't responsible for it. I didn't do anything to bring it. It was all God. It was all the authorities. It was like, okay, son, I've seen what you can do with your little water hoses down there. You're doing it good for what you've tried to do. Now here comes my river, and you're going to see Jewish people saved like you've never seen before. Just my river. It was incredible. It's not going to be your might. It's not going to be your power. It's not going to be what you've done. It's just going to be my river. I remember the feeling of, it was the middle of the night, 3 o'clock, 2 o'clock, something. I remember taking a big breath going, oh, God, it was so good. Then I went back to sleep, forgot the whole thing. And I was running the next morning, jogging with Mashiach. If you haven't jogged with Mashiach, you should jog with Mashiach. It was so good. And I was going over the Word of God, and I was going over some stuff I'd done earlier in life. I was into Revelations, and I was down to the last chapter of Revelations, and and he showed me a pure river of water of life. And I said, God, river. I remembered. It's like I'd forgotten the river for 4 hours. And when I got to that verse and said, he showed me a pure river of water of life, clear as crystal, flowing out of the throne of God and from the Lamb of God. And I was like, God, I saw that river again. And it was just as big, and it was just as pure, and it was just as God as it ever was. And I thought, I want to share that with Beth Messiah. If you're discouraged, not just about a harvest, but if you're discouraged about something in your life, listen, there is a river.